All right, we're continuing our series on improvising in training, how much you should stick to the plan versus how much you should faithfully execute the A1, A2, B1, B2, etc. in your training plan. And for this week, we wanted to talk about being flexible but still progressing. Right? Just understanding some of the trade-offs between short-term adherence to a plan and long-term progression. Because I think for a lot of coaches and a lot of athletes, the way that you achieve long-term progress is by very faithfully sticking to the plan. And in some cases, that is true. Right, that there definitely seems to be some sort of curve where, people who are new, who are beginners, who don't have a ton of experience, a lot of times what they are missing is consistency, that they're just not faithfully executing the plan, right? That they take too many days off, they modify too much stuff, they don't go as heavy as they should be going, right? So they're just kind of missing the mark a lot of the times in terms of like not being consistent and not executing, right? It's very similar with nutrition stuff, where a lot of folks who have not been, following a rigorous nutrition plan, they really just don't know how much they're snacking. They don't know how much they're skipping meals. They don't know how much they're eating restaurant meals, and that stuff derails their progress. And the way that they are going to get better as far as their body composition or health or whatever they're trying to improve is concerned is by being more rigid and like actually doing what they're quote unquote supposed to do. And for athletes, particularly in CrossFit at the advanced level, at the higher level, intermediate level, starting to approach advanced, right? A lot of these athletes are really pretty good about doing their training, right? They love training. That's why they hire a coach. It's why they follow an online program. And it's just their favorite thing to do. So adherence for them is not so much of an issue because they really they do their workouts, right? That they get their weekly email from their coach, or they load up True Coach, or they download a PDF and they're like, all right, here we go. And they faithfully execute. And so what we're hoping to talk about is for those athletes, right, how they can learn to be flexible with their training plan and how they follow their program in a way that actually improves their long-term progress. Because for them, just baseline adherence isn't necessarily the issue, right? So Luke, how do you think about this? How do you communicate this concept to the folks who you coach?
So I think with the idea of adherence, and where you might find that is quite a focus point, is usually when people are just trying to get started, right? And I think that a lot of the time you will get people, you see it quite often these days where, people are sort of putting out there that idea of, okay, you just need to do 3 days a week for the rest of your life, and for, say, more of a gem pop avatar. And I think that can be quite useful, but I think that when you are trying to create adaptation, you're trying to train for a certain purpose, you have to understand that training itself is an activity by which you sort of create that adaptation, and you create that progress over a long period of time. So a lot of the time I find with athletes, I'm sort of trying to have conversations and just trying to sort of get them to understand that the training is the activity by which you are going to sort of create the response that you want in order to progress. And where it really matters is going to be when you do a competition, when you do a qualifier workout, when you have these sort of situations where you are tested, and the sessions that you do every single day, you don't necessarily have to have as much wrapped up in them as sort of people do. You don't necessarily need to be as fixated on the details. You don't necessarily need to be trying to create improvement in any which way that you can. I think sometimes, so one thing that's been interesting for myself is, for years I would write out training programs, and I would always be looking to try and create some progression through the training program, so that therefore it allowed for some form of progression on a numerical level. So whether it would be more intensity, more set volume, etc. And what I think I'm trying to get some of my athletes to do now is just try to sort of look a little bit deeper and try to get the most out of the session, as opposed to always feeling like they have to lift 5 kilos more, because that isn't necessarily going to be how they will progress long term, and you're not necessarily able to dive into those areas which are a little bit more nuanced and that require a little bit more attention. So that could be technique. It could be hitting a certain position on a lift. Or to go even deeper down that rabbit hole, it could be just making something feel smoother, and just trying to feel better with something. And then you sort of have to play around with these sort of more subjective markers of progress, which I think for a lot of people, especially in CrossFit, is quite difficult, just because I think for a lot of people, when they do start training, there is this, you could say through whether it's the training or whether it's the messaging, but there's this big emphasis on progressive overload, and you sort of see things like linear progression, and then people get caught up in that, and then that then affects their training behaviors over a long period of time. And this is where then people become a little bit too fixated on doing the thing that's on their training program, and a little bit less focused on what it is they're actually trying to do through that training program. So I'm quite often having these conversations with athletes where it doesn't have to be heavier every single week. It doesn't have to be faster. It could just be you just spending time doing that thing. And then if it doesn't feel like you are getting anything productive out of it, it could be just missing that, or it could be saving it for another time, and it just could be just having that flexibility. And there's, I think a lot of the time there's a lot of communication that has to go through that. Sometimes just getting people to understand what it is they're doing and the reasons for it, that really helps. Just because a lot of the time, if someone does see a training program with sets, reps, and numbers, and that's pretty much it, then they're just going to follow that. There's those sort of context. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to make some form of improvement over the next 3 weeks. And then, I think when people as they train as well, they will start to develop their own ideas around how things should be as well. One thing I've noticed is, for example, athletes trying to push things on the 3rd week of something, because maybe they followed a program where it was every 3 weeks they would try to hit a PR, or they would try to test themselves out in something, and then they would deload for a week. I mean, I've certainly used that sort of structure with training, but I've actually sort of seen it in athletes where they will try to progress things, and they'll sort of see that 3rd exposure as their opportunity to really go for it. And again, it's that, what are you trying to do there? Are you actually trying to make improvement, or are you actually just trying to follow these 3-week mini cycles and make those sort of improvements within training? And it can be really difficult to distinguish the difference between between the activity and what the activity is trying to do, because they're the same thing. So I think that, you can obviously look at it from one perspective for one group of people, but I think in this scenario, if you are that type of person who is a little bit too fixated on what it is you're trying to do, and you're almost turning it into a bit of a tick box scenario, then you've got to make sure you're able to pull yourself back a little bit and understand sort of the reasoning behind what you're doing, and then adapt your experience so that you get the best possible outcome.
Yeah, Luke, I think that the concept that you're talking about there is super, super important and super insightful. Just this idea of training being, the goal of training being to improve over time, not necessarily to do the best possible performance you can do in a specific training session, right? And we've talked about that before, and plenty of other podcasts have discussed the difference between training and competing, which I think is, a super important concept for people to understand. But it's not just that, right? I mean, it's sort of like you've been touching on, is this idea of training being an attempt to sort of like poke at, your body in a way that makes it actually get better over time. So the goal of training is to perturb this complex adaptive system in a way that creates adaptation in the future. Right. And that can be like a little bit tricky to think about. And yeah, there almost certainly is some correlation between better training results and improvement. Like, okay, yeah, for sure. If you're getting better in training, then you're probably getting better in general. But that the goal of each training session is, again, this perturbation, this poking at the system. That's like, hey, you got to figure out how to deliver oxygen better to the periphery in this kind of situation. You got to figure out how to quickly resynthesize creatine phosphate so that you can lift heavy again, right? So we're poking at ourselves to create that adaptation. And that the best way to poke on a given day may not be to try to push harder, right? It may not be to do the exact session that's written down, based upon what your coach may think you need to work on. And as a coach who writes stuff down for people to work on, like, I'm very aware that the exact thing that I'm giving them is not necessarily going to be like the thing that makes them get better, right? It's a framework to think about, like, hey, here's some stuff that I think you should potentially work on. Here's some things that we would like to touch on a consistent basis, like, have at it, And that sort of fuzziness isn't necessarily the best way to create like buy-in and excitement from an athlete where you're just like, yeah, like no one knows anything, nothing works. Here's some stuff. Good luck. Hopefully it's effective, right? Like that's not like an exciting, resonating training message that makes people super amped up to get into the gym. But I do think it's closer to the truth than this idea of like, all right, on week 1, we have to do this. On week 2, we have to do that. And then we know on week 8, like you're going to hit this number. Like we just don't know it. So based upon that, what I do try to communicate to athletes is just this idea of having this plan, right? These things that we do want to work on, that we do want to focus on, but that actually being adaptable with the plan is long-term in their best interest, right? That the best way for them to achieve long-term progress is to actually develop some sort of intuition for how they're feeling and what's going well, and to be able to potentially alter the stimulus that they're going to experience on a given day in order to hopefully maximize the results that they're getting, right? And this could be sort of like we talked about in the last episode, like, hey, I just like don't feel good today. Maybe I'm going to switch my training session to the kind of like moderate intensity aerobic intervals that I'm supposed to do at some point this week, away from, the super heavy squat cleans and like a really nasty conditioning piece, right? Like, okay, yeah, everyone has some sort of intuition that like there is value in moving days like that around. And as much as we've potentially ragged on Whoop and other such things like that, right? That I do think that is a huge benefit of those things, is that they can give people the license and the intuition to be like, actually, this isn't going to work today. Let's do X, Y, Z instead. So yeah, in terms of trying to get folks to think about what they're doing, not as like the goal, but as an activity that creates improvement, and then empowering them to modify stuff based upon that. It's not necessarily easy, but I do think that that's kind of like the goal that I have in communicating these concepts with athletes.
Yeah, I think that one thing I've tried recently is just trying to. So, for example, taking a training piece, being like pretty open with how it goes, and just sort of like letting them take the lead with it, and then having a look at it, and essentially then creating a little bit more some more parameters around that training piece for the next training session. And I've been trying to sort of communicate over a little bit more of like, hey, this is not necessarily this is an experiment, but this is like I can't predict how this is gonna go, right? And I think that and there's always an element of communication that it needs to exist. But I think as soon as you start to hear people being really sure, and this is very common now in sort of social media spaces and things like that, is like people come up with this sort of very reductionist way of trying to communicate training, and people get amped up behind it, whereas yes, it is a lot more nuanced than that. And like you said, it's not necessarily always helpful to get people amped up and not necessarily be able to promise them certain things by certain times, or whatever it is. So I think striking a balance there is sort of important in terms of like how you communicate and how you can sort of prescribe and guide athletes through this process.
Yeah, so Luke, I do think that what you're saying there is super interesting, just this idea of framing things as an experiment, especially when communicating with athletes, right? Because then that gives them license to potentially move stuff around or modify it, or to just sort of like do something in a way that isn't as results focused, right? They're just being like, hey, this is just an experiment. That kind of like opens this door into this like less rigid, less structured world in a way that I think can potentially be super, super helpful. So yeah, how do you communicate that to athletes that you coach? Like, how do you frame that for them?
I suppose it's sort of, usually a lot of notes to come with training. I think the more I've got into coaching, the more I just write, not necessarily like paragraphs of information, but I just tend to add notes a lot more to their training, whereas before it was just, it was the sets, the reps and the workouts, and, everything just does its own thing. Just trying to get people to understand, okay, what's the intention behind this? What should you be trying to do for this? Sometimes I will, based off of, say, a conversation that I might have with them, it's like, okay, this is something that I think you should be able to do, and I just want you to sort of see where you go with it. And then maybe in the next session, on the next progression, it becomes a little bit more dialed in. It becomes a little bit more focused in on a certain aspect, or maybe it completely changes. But it's just trying to get people to understand that, this is more of a, this is something that the training program is just that's sort of where you can communicate with the athlete and them performing it and how they go about it. That's what sort of matters. So I think that I'll give you one example. Would be, say, I've been trying to work around getting people to, with their, say, for example, gymnastics. So I'll give them, say, a certain set volume, and then I will give them, say, some movements to do a recovery effort between, and I get them to sort of essentially choose how they approach that workout. So this was almost a bit of a choose your own journey style workout that I tried with one of my athletes, and it was a bit of an experiment. I think it was something around 30 strict handstand push-ups, and then between that they were doing, say, like non-interfering movements. So it was like, do as many strict handstand push-ups as you would like to do, and then after that I want you to perform X movement until you feel like you're recovered, and then I want you to go back into handstand push-ups, and then I want you to go into the other movement until you feel you're recovered. And I think the other movements were like box jump, step down, and calorie row. So the goal of that was literally just like, okay, we're just going to do 30 strict handstand push-ups. You're going to do it, and you're going to do it in the best way that you feel you can, and get it done as quickly as you can. And then these are these things that you have to do. And anyway, though it weren't necessarily resistant to it, but it was like, this is not your usual 8-minute AMRAP of this, and this. And I sort of get it. But it was just something for me just to sort of see where they were at with it. And then in the following week, I actually created a more interval-based structure that was just basically pushing them a little bit further than they went the week before. And then the week after, I think I did exactly the same with the interval structure, started to try and increase the amount of interference with other movements. But I think for them, it just allowed them in that first session just to be like, hey, this is what I feel good with. And if they were to mess it up or anything like that, then that would have been a good, strong learning experience for them as well. And then I also know, okay, this is where you sit with regards to this movement. Because I think sometimes, as much as I write a workout up or a training piece up and I'm like, okay, this is how I want it to go, like sometimes it can be completely different to that. And, you don't necessarily know just through the result of a workout or the result of a training piece, like how it actually went. And this is obviously where, say, video can be helpful. Them explaining how they went about it and how they felt can be helpful. I would say that this is something you should, that I only really do with more advanced athletes, and people who have just got a good amount of training volume under their belt. But it just takes the focus away from just doing a workout with 30 to 45 strict handstand push-ups in every other week or something like that, and it becomes a little bit more of like I want you to be able to improve at this skill, and bit by bit try to do this skill under harder environments and be able to sort of sustain that. Because I think sometimes people can just get caught up in they're not too. Sometimes people could be not necessarily interested in making what they can already do better, and actually are just focused on sort of new things and improving and trying to catch something that they weren't able to do previously. But who cares about that one thing that you did if you can only do it, say, 50% of the time? And a lot of the, I think we have a podcast on the importance of consistency. I think that can be something that people, although it's quite, it takes a lot of training hours to actually try to develop that, and it takes a lot of just experimenting within training as well, and a lot of repetition. But I do think that it's a worthwhile thing for people to try and work on.
Yeah, the idea of altering the training structure in a way that makes it more focused on rate of perceived exertion and kind of making decisions in a fatigue setting, I think is super, super smart, because it pulls away from some of the results focus that can come up. And, if done in a creative way, can actually recreate the kinds of decisions that people are going to have to make in the middle of a long, difficult workout, right? Should I break this up or should I not? Right? Should I try to squeak out that extra rep or should I not? Right? How hard is this for me right now? How much can I push? And, as you mentioned, sometimes that stuff can go well. Sometimes it just doesn't sort of land. And it's okay, back to the drawing board on that one. But I do really like that idea as a way of training this concept of flexibility, and then also just kind of moving things more into an RPE, like a rate of perceived exertion paradigm, right? Because I do think that this idea of rate of perceived exertion is really, really important to understanding how to kind of improvise and modify stuff on the fly, right? Because we talked about this many times, the day-to-day variation in training results is just much higher than people sort of intuitively think it's going to be, right? That people sort of have this idea that the best that they've ever done something is where they should be, and that anything less than that is a failure. And that's indicative of their future training results, right? Whereas, as coaches, and then probably athletes as well, maybe if they're not in quite as an emotional spot after maybe not doing as well on a lift or something, we have this understanding that okay, you have an expected performance on something given your past results and your capabilities. And that if you just keep testing that same thing over and over again, you're going to get a scatter shot of data points around this sort of expected value, right? Sometimes it's going to be higher, sometimes it's going to be lower, but that doesn't mean that sort of expected value has actually changed. It just means that you're going to get a spread of numbers surrounding that point. And that's something that as an athlete can be painful and can be difficult, right? Where you're just I thought I was here, but really I'm here. And it's actually you were right in the middle of those two. And those were just outlier data points on either side of it that you're not necessarily going to recreate, anytime soon. So that's something that's very, very challenging psychologically. So if we can finagle things so that they're more based upon rate of perceived exertion, then that ideally pulls away some of the attachment to the results, and then facilitates athletes understanding oh, okay, on this day, going this pace is actually hard. Whereas it was easy, last week. It doesn't mean I'm less fit. It just means that I'm at the appropriate rate of perceived exertion for me today based upon that. And that, okay, maybe that's a slightly slower pace, but I was told to go at something that's difficult, but not max effort. So that's okay with me. And I'm going to stick with this pace. And then hopefully by, repeatedly finding that appropriate level of a rate of perceived exertion, that's going to give us a better training stimulus where we're actually poking at the system to try to improve our paces overall at this rate of perceived exertion, right? To improve our paces overall, after coming off of like an AMRAP -5 set of kipping handstand push-ups or something like that, right? Because that's the kind of stuff that actually makes people better over time, is being able to lift up the amount of work that they can do at different rates of perceived exertion.
Yeah, like I think it's quite hard to. I mean, this is just an idea. I don't necessarily have any backup to this, but this is something that I think that people can understand. It's sort of, say for example, you just had that example of like a max effort -5 reps. Okay, so week 1 you do 3 rounds, max effort -5, and then the following week you do -4, then the following week you do -3, and 1 week you feel good, and then the next week you don't feel as good. So you do that -3, but you're getting the same reps as you did when you're doing -4, -5. And some people can get really caught up in that, and those small little details, when it's just doing the 3 sets around that number is what is going to be creating that progression over a long time. It's not about what you're getting at the top end. It's just about, okay, hey, just do this for 4 weeks and then you most likely are going to feel better with it. So let's do that. And I think that we write training programs in a way to just make people, we can use things like RPE, we can use things like percentages, we can use things like changing the rep schemes so they go just a little bit heavier or whatever it is. We can use that to sort of keep someone engaged within the process. But what we're trying to do is, find that thing that they need to work on, make them consistent with it in some form, make them work to some sort of, relative intensity, maybe push that marker a little bit forward, but you're just trying to find that sweet spot and just stay around there. And it might be that you're, being a bit more aggressive week to week and trying to improve it. And you're making those things very apparent within the training and within the program. So people go like, yeah, that's great. Okay. A typical example of this could be just sort of like the old school linear progression, just like add 5 pounds or add 10 pounds every single week. There comes a point when you're not necessarily able to do that. So, what happens in those programs? Those programs then start increasing the volume, and instead of doing 3x5, you're doing 5x5, and you're working a little bit more around that, within that sort of sweet spot zone. So I think that, yeah, it's as getting really bogged down in the details and, just sort of seeing reactions to training and things like that can be, as a coach, it's something I've had to try to educate people around, is that, hey, this is not that important. What is important is that you are just doing this stuff on a consistent basis and you're not trying to overshoot it to the point where you're probably going to cause too much fatigue and you're potentially going to create like a detriment in performance. And I think as well, using these types of ideas within training and when designing training, it allows you to like elongate progress as well, because you don't necessarily want to create a training program and pretty much just sort of cut yourself short at week 3, 4, 6 or whatever it is, just because you work in those sort of parameters for training cycles and things like that. If something's still going in the right direction, it's like, why does that thing not carry on? If you're still progressing. Yeah, I don't know if that idea made sense, but it's something that I don't necessarily have much backing on, but I just know that that's what I'm trying. That's what I'm trying to do personally anyway. When I'm writing someone's program and I'm just sort of knocking a rep off or adding a rep on or whatever it is each week.
Yeah, we're just trying to keep putting people in a specific spot that we think is potentially going to create some sort of adaptation, right? And that the exact details of that spot are kind of fuzzy. And that day to day, how the athlete feels is potentially going to change where that spot is. But we're just trying to like keep putting them somewhere that we think is going to create a stimulus that will make them better over time. Right. And again, that's not like the call to arms that's going to really fire people up. Like, hell yeah, I got to get in the gym because we're not really sure what actually works. And like, maybe it's this, but if we just sort of like fiddle with some different variables, we can potentially create adaptation, but we're not really sure. Like, that's not exciting, but you know, that's, I do think that that's more real. So yeah, the overall message is that the exact prescription isn't necessarily the thing. And especially for athletes who have gotten kind of past the intermediate stage, really, really sticking to the prescription at all costs is potentially detrimental and may impact their long-term progress in a way that isn't helpful, right? And that the goal is to develop this ability to kind of like improvise and modify and to use rate of perceived exertion as like a guidepost. And then hopefully through that flexibility on top of the consistency that they built up through their love of training, that's going to be a better long-term strategy for improvement than just like ruthlessly executing day after day on the exact plan laid out.